Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the continent.
Two of our favorite themes here on the continent start with the letter P: populism and puzzles. And on this episode, I have a populist puzzle for you. How does a country that is broadly in favor of integration with the EU and broadly skeptical of Russia see the continued reign of a party that is broadly skeptical of the EU and seemingly in favor of Russia? Welcome back to another episode of The Continent. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum, and on this episode, I've got Georgia on my mind. We will be talking about Georgia's recent election, what it means for the country, and how it reflects broader trends in the region. We have a special guest today, a friend of the podcast, perhaps the best friend of all, because behind the scenes, she is the one ultimately making this happen. Maia Otarashvili is the director of FPRI's Russia-Eurasia program and a real Georgian, so she has a lot to say about this. I learned a lot during my chat with her, and I hope you will too. So let's dive in. Maia, it's great to have you by. So let's start with question one. What is keeping you busy at FPRI Russia-Eurasia program these days?
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for inviting me. This is an election season, so a very busy election season. That's what's been keeping us occupied. Whether that's the election here at home and how that will impact the region that we study so closely. So U.S. policy towards Russia and Eurasia, also the election in Moldova that happened just a week ago, and now, of course, this highly contested Georgian election. So, yeah, the election season is what's on our mind at the moment.
And interesting that both the United States and Georgia have a contested Georgia, a little bit of a tie-in there. So let's pivot from the U.S. Georgia to Georgia. It's the technical term. Georgia just had elections, so was hoping you could help walk me through the results, or results with air quotes. Let's start with the, as I call the Mr. Rogers question. So who was running, what was happening, and then let's talk about what has actually happened now.
That's right. So Georgia just held its parliamentary election. So it's a parliamentary system. They have a prime minister and a president who is more of a figurehead. But it's really the parliament and the prime minister that run the country day to day. So they had a parliamentary election where the existing ruling coalition government, the Georgian Dream Party government, was running against a whole bunch of opposition parties that had formed a whole bunch of coalition parties. They were running on a bunch of coalition tickets. And I use this language very deliberately. It was confusing, even for the Georgians. Georgia, much like many European sort of governance systems, it's known for having 100 different small parties that compete in elections. So this time was no exception, except for, in order for all these small parties to have a chance at winning, they had to do a lot of coalition building even before the election, right? So they could run on a united ticket. The idea was for them to run maybe form just a couple of coalitions, but that didn't really happen. The other sort of parties and coalitions that went over the 5% threshold, that received more than 5% of the vote, it's 4 different parties. And out of those 4 different parties, actually all 4 of them are coalitions of small parties, right? So you're looking at dozens and dozens of faces and voices that even at home for Georgians was confusing and quite difficult to follow. So let's say you did not want to vote for the government. Your options were to vote for the former president Saakashvili's United National Movement that formed a coalition with a couple of other parties. And then three other sort of major party coalitions that even their names sound the same, right? So Coalition for Changes, Strong Georgia, For Georgia. So this was, even from the beginning, we knew that this was going to get a little messy, and it did. The ruling party, the Georgian Dream government that was formed by the billionaire oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili in 2012, they were estimated to receive about 41% of the votes, but they ended up receiving 54% of the votes, according to the official results. And then you had the Coalition for Change that got 11%. Saakashvili's United National Movement and Friends got 10%. And the next two coalitions got 9% and 8% of the votes, according to the formal results. So ultimately, what's there to know is that the ruling party that's been in charge since 2012, that's been increasingly authoritarian, is going to get approximately 90 out of 150 seats in parliament. You only need 76 seats to have a majority. So they will be in charge and they will not need to compromise or coalition build with anybody. So Ivanishvili's reign essentially continues in Georgia unless, all the opposition demands and the international community's calls for bringing change happens, and we can talk about that. So I'll pause here.
We can talk about it, and in fact, we will talk about it. Now, I can't help but bring forward my comparativist instincts here. Obviously, Russia and Georgia are different countries with different motivating politics and issues, neighbors as they may be. But this reminds me a little bit of Russia, maybe in confusing opposition that maybe spends more time fighting itself than the party and leadership, and now allegations of pretty flagrant falsification in the elections we're talking about. Can you tell me more about this falsification and what is alleged? Is this enough to actually swing the election results outright?
Aaron, I think it's no accident that this whole opposition party dynamic I mentioned reminded you of Russia. Ivanishvili's Georgia over the recent few years has begun to resemble Russia more and more and more, and we'll discuss that later on. But back to the tactics of how to falsify the election; those are also quite similar to how Russia has been doing it. So it's been less sort of flagrant, sort of direct ballot stuffing, although we have some video evidence of that as well. And it's a lot of voter intimidation, vote buying, outright vote buying, and really using the regions and the minority populations as sort of these sort of more easily oppressible, if you will, population. So what I mean by this is, in the areas where there's more poverty, we know this. People have been offered anywhere from 100 to 200 lari for their votes. Those who refuse to vote for the government, then they are offered money to simply stay home, or to stay home and hand over their IDs so that someone else can vote in their place. What's really interesting is voter intimidation, in my opinion. Many Georgians, again, especially in the regions, they work for, the government or places like schools and kindergartens that are government run. So, they're told your jobs will be in jeopardy. So if you don't vote for the government, you will lose your job. If you have a small business, they're threatened that their businesses will not be okay. Now, one might ask, well, how does anybody know who you voted for? You can just say that you'll vote for the government. Well, this is actually one of the major arguments in the ongoing investigation into vote rigging right now, is that it's been proven that the voting process is not confidential. For example, in this particular election, it's been proven that whoever you mark on your paper, it's done by hand, that the paper is essentially, the ballot is translucent, and there are cameras in the room. So, and the cameras are monitored by Georgian Dream officials. So as you mark your ballot and go to put it in the box, they can actually see from the other side who you marked. And again, there are the cameras there as well. So it's a combination of pre-election campaigning, fear mongering, voter intimidation, and then even on the day off, right, to be able to sort of check on your people and make sure that they are voting who they said they will be voting for. And when I say check on your people, let me clarify that as well. This is sort of down to every vote. So in every village, every community, the government has sort of these handlers assigned to different groups of people, and the handlers go and start intimidating their neighbors or their coworkers, and making sure that these people are going to be voting for the government. All of this is more rampant in the regions, among more vulnerable communities, and this is why we've seen things like, in predominantly Azeri or Armenian ethnic minority communities, the government received, I don't know, 80-90% of the votes. So it's quite fascinating.
I've also seen, and I try not to comment with my own opinions here, but some interesting statistical analysis. And there is math to the way that vote outcomes work broadly when it's actual people doing actual votes with actual human behavior. And in this case, we see some distributions, and we don't need to get too technical here, but basically wacky outliers where you have tons of turnout and tons of support for the ruling party in ways that kind of don't comport with real behavior. So it's
Absolutely. I know you love data and statistics, and I think this election is a good example of that. I've also seen some really good studies in that regard. And again, to simplify things, it looks like since the last election, the Georgian voter base grew by like 300,000 voters, and majority of those votes went to the ruling party, which made absolutely no sense. I also want to mention really quickly that the diaspora votes abroad are very interesting because there was no sign of any election rigging abroad. What they tried to do there was just not give the Georgians living abroad a chance to vote. So, for example, in the United States, they only had 3 locations in the whole country for Georgians to vote. So just New York, Washington, and LA, which made it impossible for a majority of the Georgian immigrants in the US to go and vote. But anyway, from those who voted, majority of them voted against Georgian Dream. I think, in New York, I think they received like 15% of the votes. So it's very interesting to see what happens when the election is truly free and fair, because the ruling party lost by a landslide, at the polling stations abroad outside Georgia.
now, of course, diaspora votes can be very different from domestic votes. Definitely possible. But let's zoom in on, well, we're talking about the present, but the future, be that weeks, months. What happens now? I've seen some fairly muted criticism from the EU. I know Georgia's president, who is opposition-y, if that's safe to say, calls for protests. What are the next steps here?
Yeah, on the just a quick comment on the diaspora votes, one big difference is that the fear-mongering tactics at home in Georgia work much better on the domestic voters than the voters abroad. So absolutely, I agree with you. On what happens now, that's what's really interesting. You know, the international organizations, most of them have said that the election was not free nor fair, but they've said this in a very intricate, complicated language, right? So nobody came out and started their statements with that first line. Especially the OSCE monitoring missions language was very confusing. So you had the day after the election, it was just this sort of shock and confusion in the country because people didn't really know what to make of the results, because no sort of official body came out and outright said, hey, this election was fully rigged and is illegitimate. It took a lot of time to get the international community's take on what was going on. Although at home they knew, right, that the outcome was not right. Again, the expectation was that the ruling party would receive about 41% of the votes, not 54%. So, yeah, I personally am very underwhelmed by the international community's response, especially from the US. There was an initial statement from the Secretary of the State, Tony Blinken, and now the White House has published a statement by President Biden that calls on the Georgian authorities to repeal some of the more authoritarian laws and also to investigate these election irregularities. Similarly, the European Union, many EU parliamentarians, and now the EU mission to Georgia have called for a detailed investigation into the irregularities, right? So they're saying, yes, the election was not free nor fair, but they're not saying that the resulting parliament would be illegitimate. Instead, they're stopping there and now saying, we are calling for a detailed investigation into the irregularities. But what would that yield? What that would mean, we don't know. But also, in order for the investigations to take place, the government, meaning the one that just won this election, would have to cooperate and essentially be in charge of carrying out such investigations. So that's from the international community side. If you want to get a little more dramatic, I called it these statements toothless on my X account, but at home it's also a very interesting situation. The president has come out and said the elections were fully stolen using Russian tactics, and this only serves Russia, and this was a fully illegitimate election. And then the opposition parties, those who overcame the alleged sort of 5% threshold. But again, if the election was rigged, how do we know which other parties would have, passed this 5% threshold? That's a separate conversation. But anyway, these opposition parties have said, one, we will not take our seats in parliament, so we will boycott. And two, they're demanding a redo of the election. So they want the election to happen all over again, but for it to be administered by some kind of an international electoral body slash organization. Ambiguous language. That is not going to happen, right? One is because that's not in sync with what the international community is saying. They're calling for an investigation, not for a redo of the election. And two, who is going to come into Georgia and run an entire parliamentary election in conflict with the government's preferences, right? So again, we're looking at a lot of this kind of delusional and confusing thinking and actions from the opposition forces in Georgia. So this is why we saw big rally on Monday that the president organized in Tbilisi. But since then, we see again a lot of confusion domestically. The voters don't know what they're supposed to do. So it's the question of what now. Domestically, I don't think there's much of a momentum for a large uprising. And internationally, there is some leverage and there are some cards that the Americans and the Europeans are holding, but I don't know when they might deploy those sticks.
Worth noting, I was reading not everyone opposed the election result. I heard that Hungary's Viktor Orban arrived in Georgia before the EU could even make a statement. What are your thoughts on that tie-in to this global trend of liberalism?
That's right. And also, even on the day of the election, as sort of the preliminary results came out, many of the Russian officials came out congratulating the Georgian Dream government and saying that Georgia had chosen the right way. So we know the Russians are quite happy about how the election went. And then Orban arrives essentially the day, I believe it was the day after the election. He arrives to congratulate the Georgian Dream government. So I think Orban's role is very interesting, right? Again, he is, leads an EU member country, yet is, so excited about formally an EU candidate country going in an anti-EU direction. But this just tells you, right? This is a wave. This is a regional trend, and Georgia is not just about Georgia. There is more at play here.
We are going to pause our substantive conversation because we have now arrived at my favorite part of the Continent podcast, the language learner part, where I ask every guest to do some homework, bring a word that describes the situation, be it a technical word, a slang word. So today, we're going to learn some Georgian. I cannot promise I'll be able to pronounce this word, Georgian being a very difficult language. All that preface aside, Maia, what is your word of the day?
Aaron, so first of all, you're very good at pronouncing Georgian words, and you make excellent toasts at Georgian Supras. I've had the privilege of attending those with you, so you're very humble. But I have to tell our listeners that you're very good at understanding and speaking Georgian. I have an easy one for you this time, and it's really the backstory that I think is interesting. When the election sort of was wrapping up, and even at the rally that I just mentioned, right, with the major opposition rally that came out to say the election was stolen, so the official results are saying that we lost. um, every speaker came out and congratulated the people for winning the election first. So again, maybe it's just me, right? But a lot of confusing language. So congratulations on winning. We won. Then they would go into talking about how the election was stolen and they didn't actually win. And then in the end of their speech, they would say, "We're going to win." So it's, the word winning has just, to me at the moment, I'm a little cynical about it, right? Because it's all about what power you give it. But what's interesting about the word winning is that in Georgian, hello is gamarjoba. And it derives from the word winning, which is gamarjveba. So really, when you say hello to somebody, you're really saying victory to you. So the word of the day today is gamarjveba, which is victory, which is a word that both political sides in Georgia have kind of co-opted and made their own this time. And to me, it has lost a little bit of its meaning in this context. But the word is gamarjveba, which is victory.
Fascinating context to hear. Thank you for that. I have a couple of things I'm puzzled about with Georgian politics. So let me tell you the truth, or my truth. You can tell me if I'm wrong. But broadly speaking, and some of this is stuff I've experienced in real life in Georgia. So I would say Georgians are broadly skeptical of Russia. The kind of evidence for that being that while I was there, people, if I was speaking Russian, would sometimes not be willing to talk to me unless they knew I was American first, and then speaking Russian with a non-Russian, that was just a common language. No baggage there. Not least, I mean, the foreign policy, Russia, occupying a large chunk of Georgia. So skepticism there, distrust. Part two, Georgians are broadly in favor of integration with the West and the European Union. Now, here's the confusing part. Georgian Dream Party, and I do not think I'm exaggerating, I wouldn't say it's necessarily pro-Russia, but at very kind of worst Russia-related neutral. So very kind of cautious about Russia, and has been increasingly critical of the EU and the European values. So how do you square a party that ostensibly is against the things that most Georgians believe, winning in quotes or generally elections?
I think that's the most important question, and I think you framed it really brilliantly. You are absolutely correct in your statements. This is why it's such an interesting case, right? One, the Georgian dream being sort of pro-Russian, getting its assignments from Russia, if you will. That's no longer a conspiracy theory. It's gone past that point. It started with the idea that, well, the billionaire oligarch in charge, Ivanishvili, made his wealth in Russia. Who gets out of Russia, with all of their money in tow and gets out safely and gets to continue to live and operate independently? Well, you know better than I do. Nobody. He was the largest individual shareholder of Gazprom. I think he had 2%, and he has said that he sold it off. But anyway, all of this started with that, right? Ivanishvili was directly associated with Russia and Russian influence. And now, after all these years, there's plenty of evidence of significant Russian political and financial influence in Georgia. So let's just say that, the Georgian Dream is a Russian sympathizer party, but they're very careful about not coming out as, vocally pro-Russian. What they have done, however, especially in the recent years, they've been very vocally anti-Western. They've been bullying American diplomats and European diplomats. They've been feuding with anyone from Zelensky, the Ukrainian president Zelensky, to any head of the EU missions to Georgia. It's been incredible, and they've been openly promoting ideas about the U.S. State Department trying to overthrow the Georgian government or somehow meddle with Georgia's political stability and security. I mean, this comes from the mayor of Tbilisi or the prime minister. So they have been very openly anti-Western and spinning a lot of anti-Western conspiracy theories. One of those, sort of my favorite one, is this notion of a global war party. Ivanishvili and the leaders of his party, again, so this is not sort of the word in the street. This is what the Georgian Dream officials have said, that the United West is something called the Global War Party that is trying to open up, this is a direct quote, open up a second front in Georgia, meaning make sure that the war in Ukraine spreads into Georgia. They've been running on this platform ever since the war in Ukraine started. And really, the culmination of this was the campaign for this election, where these huge posters, the campaign posters from Georgian Dream, showed essentially a split screen of a black and white bombed Ukrainian city, and then next to it, a picture of a Georgian church or something in color. And underneath, with big letters, it said, "Choose peace, not war." And then the narrative behind that was the West is trying to open up a second front in Georgia with Russia. If you do not choose the Georgian Dream Party and you choose the opposition is aligned with the West, and the West is trying to start a war here. So, what's really interesting is that the pro Russian government is using the potential Russian threat as a way to get reelected and continue its anti-Western policies and keep bringing Georgia closer to Russia. Again, the sort of the big bad wolf, right, that they're saying is going to come and invade us if you don't choose us. The I don't even know what to call this. Maybe you have a good word for it, but it's unbelievable. I
There
mean,
is, in the international relations theory, you can read about bandwagoning and how countries caught between larger powers, be that as it may, choose to go along with one of the powers or resist that influence. So, last question here. We've talked about this Ivanishvili guy who we know is fantastically wealthy. I think I read that his wealth is about a quarter of Georgia's entire GDP. And he owns, I mean, like large chunks of the country. I think quite literally. I remember being in Tbilisi with the FPRI crew and someone on the trip pointing out some of his residences and buildings he owns along the way. So we've talked about kind of Georgia Dream's approach to Russia. What do you think Ivanishvili wants? What is his outcome here?
Yeah. Just to quickly comment on bandwagoning, I think what's interesting in Georgia's case is, or the Georgian Dream's case, is the blatant cynicism behind it, right? So, again, sort of saying that we have to go with Russia, but if we don't, they will invade us. And if we go with the West, Russia will also invade us. Just, I have to quickly mention that meanwhile, this, Putin has announced that, has accelerated his efforts to build a naval base in Ochamchire, the breakaway Georgian territory in Abkhazia. Ukraine has said that they will bomb the naval base, right? So the reality of this is that there's actually a good chance that the Georgian Dream and Putin combo might actually be the ones that lead to opening up a second front in Georgia by sort of essentially having Ukraine bomb formally what is Georgian territory. But again, maybe that's a conversation for a separate podcast. But back to Ivanishvili, other than cynicism, what is his goal? In addition to all these other laws that the Georgian Dream adopted this year, one that kind of flew under the radar is something called the offshore law. This year, the Georgian parliament adopted a law that says that if anyone brings in their wealth into Georgia from abroad, it will not be taxed. And then Ivanishvili brought in majority of his money from abroad into Georgia. He, over the recent years, he has been feuding with banks like Credit Suisse, where a lot of his money went missing, apparently. Um, Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that this story has always been about money, about Ivanishvili's wealth and the safety of his wealth. I believe that's what most oligarchs are about, right? Where can I park my money that it is going to be safe? How can I grow my money is one of those, but also how can I make sure that my money is safe? And from a lot of these, leaks about a lot of offshore accounts where Ivanishvili's money kept showing up, to now this Credit Suisse dispute, I think Ivanishvili started to believe that his money was not safe abroad. There were a lot of talks about him getting sanctioned and his assets being frozen, again, because of what he's been doing in Georgia. So, from what I understand, he has brought majority of his money into Georgia, and that means that he needs to stay in power so he can make sure his money is safe. Um, I believe it's that simple. And he needs to make sure that Georgia is an environment that is friendly to his personal needs and interests. So that is not too Western, that it remains independent, but does not upset Russia too much. And that he can continue to, live his life in safety in Georgia and keep doing all these weird experiments with his gardens and trees and health, and it's a whole thing. Again, very Russian.
Well, we heard about bandwagoning as a theory. This ties into a theory by hip hop group Wu-Tang Clan, who posited cash rules everything around me.
There
Cream.
we go.
There's your explanation of the day. Maya, thank you for joining, for teaching me and hopefully the listeners a little bit about Georgia. Great to have you by.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
I have another word for you. Madloba in Georgian means thank you, so madloba to Maya and to you, listener, for joining. The Continent podcast is brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. We'll catch you soon.